right. Welcome to Rood Riddle's Client Education Seminar. And we're going to start off with our raffle items. The first item is, and they have a great gift item for us. A gift bucket containing assorted branded Boehringer Ingelheim products, including a men's Puffy US, thermal tumbler, branded polo wraps, and other BI branded items, and a BI branded charcuterie board. And so the winner of that is number 454903. Do we have a winner? Okay, the next item is provided by Neogen and is represented tonight by Jennifer Striplin. It's a great item. They have Stanley thermos branded with Ariat logo and Yeti mug branded with Ariat logo, and a small green bucket with Neogen's companion hand sanitizer, Biofilm disinfecting spray, and a Neogen mask. And the winner of that is number 454919. All right, real good. Okay, so Jennifer is going to deliver your win. And the next item is a very popular one from Zoetis, represented by my son, Alex Riddle. And they have a Zoetis basket of cheer. And the winner of that is from the Liquor Barn. And the winner is number 454923. All right.
Oh, my goodness.
We'll keep it all in the family. Okay, so Alex is delivering that to his brother-in-law, Dr. Fraley. Okay, the next winner, the next offering is from Hallway Feeds, represented tonight by Anthony Cook. And they have a Hallway branded hat, jacket, and a $50 gift certificate to Hallway Feeds. And the winner is number 562387.
All right.
Okay. Real good. So she's delivering your item right here. And the next item is from Platinum Performance, and they're represented tonight by Lauren Carlisle. We have a 10-pound bucket of Platinum Performance Equine Wellness and Platinum Performance branded logo wear. And the winner of that is number 454904. We have a winner? Okay. The next item is from Aurora and Wire to Wire, and they're represented tonight by Mike Duvall. They have a $100 gift card to Cabela's Sporting Goods. And that number is 454924. All right. The next item is 2 tickets to the Bluegrass Farms Charities Monster Bash, which tell me when that is held, Julie. October 29th. It's a $250 value, and the winner of that is number 562400. All right,
Oh,
real good, real good.
Great.
If I didn't say this already, Bluegrass Farms Charity is represented tonight by Julie Kwasniewski. And Rood Riddle Veterinary Pharmacy is providing the next item, and that is an 8-pound bucket of Performance Equine Bone Right, an 8-pound bucket of Performance Equine product, Natural Hoof, and a tub of EquiShield powder, a bottle of Fly Guard, and a Rood Riddle Veterinary Pharmacy logo wear. And the winner of that is 562163. We have a winner. Okay. Okay. The next number, again for the Rood Riddle Veterinary Pharmacy item, they're represented tonight by Linda Boyd, 562384. Okay. And the final item for tonight is from Rood Riddle Equine Hospital, also represented by Linda Boyd, is a Rood Riddle gift basket filled with Rood Riddle branded items, including men and women's raincoats, hats, winter scarves, coffee mugs, and tumblers. And the winner of that is number 562156. Do we have a winner? 562156. Okay,
Roll 'em.
so we'll draw again. 562423. Do we have a winner? All right, real good.
All right.
That's one of the nicer items for the night, so congratulations. Okay. We'll start the seminar in just a moment, but we'll start off with a question. Why does Rood Riddle support the local community and the horse industry? We do it because it's not only is it the right thing to do, but we also know that when the local community and the horse industry thrive, that Rood Riddle does as well. Rood Riddle does so much more than provide excellent care for horses. The list of our involvement is too long to itemize, but a few of the things we do include Hats Off Day, which promotes and celebrates the horse industry, the Rood Riddle Grand Prix, which is an excellent show jumping competition and supports local charities, this seminar and others, which seek to educate horsemen and horsewomen. We also serve as donors to the Central Kentucky Blood Bank, which provides blood for many area hospitals. Sponsorships of organizations like the Breeders' Cup, Bluegrass Farms Charities, the United States Hunter Jumper Association, and the National Horse Show. I'm sure that Rood Riddle will always be an excellent member of the local, national, and international communities. Tonight, we want to make sure that we thank our sponsors. We've just heard their raffle items. It's Boehringer Ingelheim, Hallway Feeds, Neogen, Platinum Performance, Zoetis, and Rood Riddle Equine Hospital and Rood Riddle Veterinary Pharmacy. Finally, I want to thank Latana Wilson and Whitney Phills for all their help in putting on this evening's event. So if you know them, please thank them before you leave. And also, thanks to Linda Boyd for her help. We're continuing with our question and answer format, and the first speaker is going to be Dr. Mariah Schnobrich, a member of our ambulatory part. department and also of our theriogenology group. She will be addressing fescue toxicity.
Okay, so before I start, I have props. We're going to be talking about fescue, and I have to admit that my nutrition class, I met my husband, and I didn't pay as close attention as I could have. So I'm going to pass these plants around so you can look at them and you know what fescue looks like, because I think that's helpful. And Krista lent me the plants, so we'll collect them and review. Thank you, everybody who came. I know it's, Tuesday night, and exciting to have everybody here, and it is, I look out, I see a ton of people I know and really care about, so I appreciate you guys taking the time. This event, I always feel, is a really nice opportunity to see everybody and also give you guys something back. So I really try to think hard on not wasting your time. When you're sitting here, I want to make sure, at least from my part, and we have some great speakers tonight, that you guys walk out of here with some nuggets that are useful, novel, new, and applicable for this next year so that you can help get the best results that you can. Let me just make sure this is working. Okay, so my topic tonight is on fescue toxicity in equine reproduction. And anyone who works with horses, cattle, if you've been trained in really any agriculture or pasture management, this is something you're going to hear about. Why I thought this was particularly important tonight is in the past year, I have really recognized the breadth of effects that when you have fescue toxicity, you can see issues with, which I admit I wasn't quite aware of. And so I hope by sharing this with you guys, there may be some things that pop to your mind when you start to see symptoms that may make you take a closer look at your pasture. And I'm going to just briefly go over some of this. I would encourage you at the end of the talk, I have a link to UK's forage outreach group. They have excellent information on how to identify the plants, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to briefly touch on this to kind of give you an understanding of what's happening and then what are the effects we see in equine reproduction and what can we do about it. So what is tall fescue when we talk about tall fescue? So we're passing those plants around. That's what it looks like. It's a cool season perennial grass. It was introduced in the 1940s, and it was initially designed to help as a livestock feedstuff, feed, pasture, turf, and erosion control. In our region, if you look at this map, the primary target region is right where we live. And in talking to the pasture outreach program, they said that there is not one pasture they've looked at that doesn't have fescue in it. So the question is, how much of it is there? On average, it's reported to be about 20% of the grasses that are present in a pasture. But what I think is really important to recognize is that based on the stresses of that pasture, the location, the seeding, and basically how you manage it, that percentage of fescue can change dramatically. So you may have a mixed seeding that you do initially, but if the pasture is stressed, the fescue may outgrow the other grasses. So while you think initially you may be doing a mixed proportion and have it under control, as you start to see some of the reproductive effects or other things, and if you're not particularly comfortable with evaluating your pasture, it's important to think that these pastures are dynamic, and the temperature, the humidity, all these things, overgrazing, can change the concentration of fescue in your pasture. So when we talk about fescue, it's actually not the grass that's the issue. It's this little fungus called an endophyte that actually lives within the cell of the plant. And this is kind of confusing because when you learn about it, people say fescue toxicity. So it's not the grass itself, it's that there is a little fungus, and in this little drawing here, that squiggly line is the mycelium of that fungus, and it lives within the plant. They figured this out in the 1970s, and I've identified about 3 to 4 types of fungus that like to live in fescue. And if you go out into a pasture that's wild type fescue, about 80 to 100% of the plants will be infected with this fungus. And why would a fungus decide to live with a plant? Well, they actually have a symbiotic relationship. So the plant from the fungus actually gains some protective effects. So if you had a plant with that didn't have the fungus and you have a plant that does have the endophyte, this one with the endophyte will produce chemicals that make it resistant to pests, drought, and it also helps the plant grow better. So why that's an issue is that if you have a mixed population, if there's a fungus present, it's gonna help promote the growth of this plant, and that fungus produces a toxin, and that toxin is very bad for livestock, cattle, sheep, and horses. And so it's important to understand that when you look at grass, it's not all infected with it, but you may have to test that grass to identify if the toxin is present. So when we talk about fescue, and this again gets a little bit confusing, but basically there's just the plant itself, which would be non-endophyte fescue. That is not toxic because it doesn't have the endophyte or the fungus in it that's producing a toxin. And there's different strains of that, like Kentucky 32 is an example of that. But if you tested that and put it in pasture with the plants that do have the endophyte, it is not as resilient. So oftentimes when we try to seed our pasture with this, it just doesn't do as well. There's also what's called a novel fescue, a novel endophyte fescue, and this was discovered in the 1990s, and what it was is tall fescue that they identified an endophyte that doesn't produce the toxin. So those are also, both of those would be safe for grazing. So just having fescue in your field isn't the issue completely, it's whether you have fescue that is growing the endophyte that produces the toxin. Hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, there's tons of manuals on there out there, but I just want to talk about that to sort of break them down. So basically, you need the fungus to produce this toxin. What is the toxin? What does it do? What are we talking about? So the endophyte is producing a toxin. There's two classes. This is kind of more science lingo, but there's an alkaloid class of ergopeptines, and the most common one that we hear about in horses is ergovaline, and you're going to hear me talk about that again, but ergovaline is the one that is causing the decrease in some of the hormones that cause the problems that we see, such as progesterone and prolactin. So when we talk about, and I'm going to go through some of the reproductive effects, this toxin decreases prolactin, and that causes mares not to make milk. So two classes, and then the second class, the low-lean alkaloids, usually causes more issues in cattle, some of the vasoconstrictive effects, heat intolerance, those kind of things. And this graph that I have up here, I think this is a really important thing to emphasize for all of us managing horses, is that the levels of ergovaline, or that toxin, are going to vary with the time of year. So, and that also has to do with how the plant is growing. So if you look over, see if I can get the, you probably can't see that, but if you start January, February, and March, the ergovaline level, which again is the toxin that is causing the problems, that is low. And then in April, May, and June, it spikes. So it's this kind of 60-degree, the weather that we see here, there is a huge rise. So you may start off the season not seeing issues, but when you get to this time of year and you start to see problems, it's time to start thinking about maybe looking at your pasture. There's also a second spike later in the fall. As it goes from the really hot weather to slightly cooler, you'll see another spike. So those, if you were to be, the way I would translate that into something practical for you is you probably don't have to worry too much about it December, January, February, but you start seeing drops in some of your reproductive parameters, increased issues with your dystocias, recognize that these ergovaline levels are rising and your pastures may be an issue. So what do we know about horses and these toxins? In general, there's not a ton of research on the effects in race horses because they're usually not out on an endophyte of fescue pasture, right? Yearlings, there's some evidence that it may inhibit growth and cause an increase in physitis. And in stallions, they looked at some of the parameters, small group of horses, and minimal effects. But it's likely that if we were to look at a larger group, we may be able to tease out some of these detrimental effects. And so I just want to emphasize that if you are seeing things like this and you have concern or you're noticing that it may be related to one pasture versus another, consider testing your pasture for ergovaline levels because it can cause some issues. The main thing that we see a problem and that I think most of us are familiar with is the pregnant mare. I'm going to go through kind of the symptoms that we see because of these toxins. So when they get above levels 200 parts per billion to 300, we see things like increased gestational length, so up to 13 months. In mares that were on this pasture, the gestation could go out to 13 months, And the foals that are born are large, and they're usually not well muscled. And obviously, if you have a very large foal born that late, it can lead to dystocias. In one study, they had 91% of the mares on fescue infected fields have dystocias. And that is obviously a huge problem. So if you're starting to see a lot of issues, if your foals are coming out, you've got delayed gestation length and large lanky foals, this is something to think about. The effects on the placenta are also characteristic. They cause a thickening of the placenta. Also the red bag, so what we have in this lovely picture to get your attention. You should see when you have to Google images or go through your images, the things that come up are horrifying, but I would say this one's, moderate. We all know what we're looking at. But here we have the mare's vulva, and when the mare foals, you have amnion, the white membrane around the hooves, or the hooves themselves are coming out. When you see this red velvety surface presented at the vulvar lips, this is an emergency, because basically that surface is responsible for oxygen exchange, and if it's separated, the foal no longer has that. So when you see that, we know that that's an emergency. But fescue toxicosis causes a significant increase in these red bag deliveries, and that can lead to significant fetal compromise, including stillborns. The foals themselves, as I said, can be born dead. They can be born immature. They have a lot of dysmaturity issues. Because the mare is not necessarily producing milk, one of the other topics here is the agalactia, or lack of milk production. So the colostrum quality is really poor, and also a lot of these mares are not going to produce enough milk to achieve a normal growth rate for the foals. Also, hyperthyroidism has been described in horses on fescue that's endophyte infected, and they have poor immunity because of the colostrum and some other thoughts of how this could affect them. I have down here decreased return to cyclicity. This wasn't something I recognized as an issue with fescue, but this means that after the mare foals, she may take a lot longer to come back into heat. So if you're seeing that in a bunch of your mares, I think what I want to highlight is clinically, when I'm out on the farm, we do see a range of these symptoms. So if you start to check off your list and you have a few of these, I think it's important to kind of think of fescue. This graph is kind of to show you how dramatic this effect is. This was taken from a study done by Dr. Smith from UK, and what it shows you is that the green bars are the mares that were on endophyte-free pasture, so no toxin exposure, and the orange shows you mares that were on pasture that had that toxin. So if we start from left to right, most of the foals will carry to term. Foaling problems, there were no problems in the mares that foaled that were on no toxin, but look at the difference in that. So dystocia is a real and significant issue here. And that obviously is going to have issues for the mare. So if you look at the far right column, you see that this is actually causing death in some of the mares related to how bad this dystocia is. Differences in lactation are quite marked. The foals alive at birth, that column is from a study that only had 3 foals that were born. So some of these studies are smaller groups, and so the results look very dramatic, and I just do want to caution you to kind of interpret that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but these are studies that were done, and these are the results they got. So I think this is pretty significant. And then this table shows you on the left, as the concentration of ergovaline increases, we see an increase in these problems. So like everything in science, horse management, it's not a black and white issue, it's a gradient. And so as the concentration of ergovaline that these horses are exposed to increases, and the number of plants that are left to them, if it's in a pasture that has 10% fescue but a high ergovaline, that's probably not as significant as a pasture that has a whole ton of fescue and moderate levels of ergovaline, because their load that they're getting is higher. I don't know if that makes sense, but the point is that obviously as they increase exposure, you're going to start seeing significant issues in the foaling mares, and I'll talk about the non-foaling in a second. The next graph here just shows you the difference in the gestation length. So on the in the green is the mean. And for mares that were on pasture that did not have the toxin, average gestation length is what we would think about, 336 days. That's pretty normal. The mares on fescue were 20 days on average longer. That's significant when we're trying to breed mares back and all of that. And then the foal weight was fairly comparable. Remember that these foals are born later, so that kind of skews the results a little bit. Okay, this to me was the most interesting when I went through the literature, and I have kind of like a guy pulling his hair out because this is what we all do. In April, when we get a per cycle pregnancy rate of 42%, no one's happy with that. They actually look a lot worse than that usually. So if we look at the non-pregnant mare, the mare that is out in the pasture, you're breeding her, whether she's a maiden or a barren, the studies, there was a study done at MSU, Mississippi State, and they looked at the mares that were on novel endophyte, so no toxin produced versus toxin. The ones on the pasture that had the novel endophyte had an 87% pregnancy rate, which we'd all be pretty happy with. Those with the toxin had a 62% pregnancy rate. That's pretty significant. Again, that's only 8 mares. The next study looked at a little bit larger group, and it was 75% of mares on non-toxin pasture versus 45%. That is really, that to me is scary. So if you are not aware of your ergovaline levels and you're seeing you're ticking along, February, March, and then April hits and you hit a slump, which I can say clinically I have seen on several farms, think about fescue. If all of a sudden one field in the group in one mare barn continues to have a consistently low per cycle pregnancy rate, I would think about fescue. Also, there's increased loss. So 7% or 10% is really our high normal of acceptable loss up to 40 days of gestation. And obviously in older mares that can even be a little higher, but 30% is way out of the normal. And we had a farm that I've worked with a few where you see that their ergovaline levels are very high, and sometimes the pregnancy loss rate can get up to about 20%, which when we're talking about the value of the animals, it's very concerning. They also can have prolonged luteal function, so it's going to take them longer to come back into heat. Okay, again, this is just to show you that as those ergovaline levels increase, we see more significant effects. So when you get up above 1,000 parts per billion, that's when you're seeing embryonic loss, lower pregnancy rates. In talking to the extension program, they say that for pregnant mares at about 200 parts per billion is when they start to see issues for the ergovaline concentration. And in non-pregnant mares, they see effects somewhere between 500 and 800 parts per billion. Okay. So what can we do very quickly? These are all things that have been suggested. I'm not going to go too much into detail because I know I'm running out of time, but you can remove the tall fescue. That's honestly pretty unreasonable to do because it's so expensive to kill fields and reseed. So a lot of times that may not be practical, but that is one option. Planting the Kentucky 32 or the Max Q are two different lines of fescue that would not have the toxin, so you could do that. You can also dilute your pasture by adding more legumes like clover or alfalfa. Mowing is a very important, easy to do strategy because the ergovaline and the endophytes focus in the seed head and at the base of the plant. If you look at really well-maintained horse pasture, it's short. It's not right down to the nub, it's somewhere in the middle. And that helps protect the horses from getting those really high levels. So it sounds crazy, but maintaining those pastures are important. There are herbicides that you can use that are selective for killing the tall fescue. Plateau is one that you guys may have heard of. The issue is that with that is it can also cause some issues with weed overgrowth. So you want to use that cautiously. And then selective grazing and forage. So let's say you identify that you do have a huge problem with a certain field, keeping your mares up or adding supplemental hay has been something that's been proposed. Something more palatable like an alfalfa helps dilute how much of the fescue they're getting in. And then also because we've talked about when those ergovaline levels spike, So April, May, and then again September, October, being cognizant of that when you're grazing your horses or which horses you're grazing on there. And then domperidone is something that we use pretty regularly in practice to counteract the effects of fescue. And in general, it's sort of a recommended standard that if you start 30 days before foaling with domperidone, if you have mares on pasture with fescue, that should be protective. I can tell you, reading through this literature, it's really interesting because some of the nutritionists are recommending taking the mares off those pastures 90 days, much farther. And I was surprised by that because even in vet school, I was taught you put them on domperidone, they're fine for 30 days. Those studies, they showed it improved it, but we don't really know whether that's better than not being on it at all. So if you're starting to see issues, think about that, either starting your domperidone earlier or making some management changes. And then testing the pasture. I think some of the farms that I've worked with, that has been hugely beneficial for them because they recognize that they're starting to have an issue. They can make management changes. It's not hard to do. And my last slide is to plug the UK Plant and Soil Science Forage Extension Program. These guys are fantastic. They have taught me a lot about how to do this. The farms that I've worked with and that work with these guys have increased the pasture productivity, and I think have a lot of peace of mind in knowing that their horses are grazing on pasture that is relatively free from this toxin. And when we talk about the whole range of effects, it's pretty impressive. So I've gone way over my time. Krista Lee is outside. If you want to, oh, there she is in the back. She is fantastic, okay? She's great. So if you have questions, contact her. I told her she might get flooded with stuff, but if you go onto their website, there's an equine program, and you can look for your county extension agent, or if you don't have patience for going through website clicks, you can also call Krista, and I asked her permission, her information's on there. Okay, I went way over, but I hope that's helpful. Thank you, everyone.
The next speaker tonight is Dr. Kate Christie. Kate is a member of our internal medicine department, and she's going to be talking about the new rotaviral diarrhea that many farms, unfortunately, were very familiar with this year. So, Dr. Christie.
I didn't know we were supposed to bring show and tell, but I think that diarrhea samples probably aren't welcome here. That's cute. Here we go. So a lot of you, hopefully, who have interest in this subject were able to attend the rotavirus short conference, or I guess day-long conference that UK held, which was really, really helpful. I think one of the best things about that short meeting that they had was that a lot of farm managers came together to kind of talk about their experiences and really kind of share with each other what helped break this horrible, horrible diarrhea cycle at their farms, what didn't work, maybe what we can do going forward to try and prevent this problem from happening again. So we're going to talk about the 2021 version of rotavirus, which was a little different. So just starting, for those of you who don't manage a lot of foals, diarrhea is a very, very common cause of morbidity, in some cases mortality in our young foals. About 50% of foals, they estimate, will have at least one episode of diarrhea outside of kind of our full heat diarrhea by the time they're 6 months of age. So it can be a significant problem. There are infectious and non-infectious causes of this. So most of the infectious ones we think about clostridial organisms, though there's a little bit of gray area there. Salmonella certainly in some of our more compromised foals, and then the most common one being rotavirus in this population, and a lot of mammalian populations actually. The biggest thing that we think about, especially in a large area with a lot of foals, is that we do need to consider the economic impact that this can have. Treating and managing a foal that's really sick with diarrhea can get very, very expensive in a hurry. Certainly we can have some losses, so secondary complications typically if your foal, if we're not able to get good intensive management care, again, not as much of a problem here. And then of course secondary complications as well. So our neonatal population is much more at risk for developing sepsis or spread of bacteria in the bloodstream than our adult horses. And we can see secondary complications, pneumonia, and then joint infection being probably one of the biggest ones that can seriously lead to morbidity or mortality in these foals. So what is rotavirus? Just a brief overview of it. It is an enteric virus that attacks mostly and replicates in the GI tract. It's an infectious cause of diarrhea, again, in a lot of animals. So it's the most common cause of diarrhea in human infants under the age of 5, also seen in not only our mammals, but avian species as well. There are 9 different sort of species of rotavirus. A is highlighted there because that is our typical rotavirus. So the most common cause of rotaviral diarrhea in our foals, most mammalian species, in humans, and then in our avian species as well. B, C, and H have also been shown to cause diarrhea in mammalian populations and in humans, and then D, F, and G, a little bit more common in our avian species. There is an E species that we're not quite sure if we want to give it a real species, but it's seen in pigs, so that's why it's not listed there. There is some evidence that we can have transmission across species. So of these different groups of rotavirus, we can jump from one species to another. So there is some zoonotic potential. And the virus is really great at changing itself. So like a lot of the other viruses we've talked about in 2021, it changes and morphs and can cause different disease in different groups. In terms of our foals, so again, rotavirus A being far overrepresented in most of the cases of rotaviral outbreaks. And between 20 and 77, depending on the study we look at and the population we look at, but 20 to 77% of foal diarrhea outbreaks we can trace back to rotavirus A. In 2014 in Kentucky, they did do a survey. About 35% of foals presenting with diarrhea were positive for rotavirus A, and about 3% of healthy foals that they looked at were shedding it. So much overrepresented in our diarrhea foals. The 2 different subtypes or strains that we see mostly in horses are the G3 and G14 strains. Those just describe all those fun little surface proteins that we won't get into. G3 was first identified in 1975 in a population of UK foals. So that is a little bit more of a new discovery. And then the G14 strain came about in about 2005, and it's taking up a larger and larger percentage of the rotavirus A that we see in our population. It's most common, or it affects young foals, so between 2 and 160 days of age. Much more common in younger foals, and the foals less than 30 days of age, we see much more severe clinical signs. So kind of explains what happened this year as well, because of course most of the neonates that were affected were very, very young animals. Generally, there's a high morbidity. These animals shed a lot of virus, and it's very, very infectious. So a lot of the foal crop can be affected, especially in this year's example, which we'll get to in a minute, but generally low mortality. So most of these foals do survive if they get appropriate care. In terms of how we transmit rotavirus, so it's fecal oral, so these foals are picking it up, either nursing, chewing off the ground. And I think one of the important things to notice about rotavirus is it's got a really short incubation time. So by the time this foal gets infected, it can be less than 48 hours before it's really, really, really sick. And the important thing about that is that they are shedding very high numbers of this virus at the beginning of their illness, and we might not even notice, that one is really, really sick until it's already passed it on to the next, to the next, to the next. So it's a horrible domino effect because it does happen so quickly. There is evidence of asymptomatic shedding as well, so healthy foals may be shedding this, healthy mares can shed it as well, so not necessarily a horse that shows clinical signs of diarrhea. And then you need to consider as well past resolution of clinical signs. We do see these foals continue to shed, so anywhere between 3 and 10 days is typical after the diarrhea has resolved, but they certainly can shed longer. The other important thing about rotavirus is it is very sticky. It likes to stick around in our environment and can be very difficult to kill, which makes it, again, extra risk for sort of being pervasive throughout the seasons. But it can persist in the environment for up to 9 months and is, again, very difficult to disinfect in some cases. So what does it do? The viral particle itself gets into our small intestine, and this is just a close-up electron microscopy view of the normal appearance of the small intestine. It has those nice tall villi, and all of those have absorptive cells. They have cells that make the enzymes that break down the food that the foals eat. Most importantly is that they have a very high milk diet, so they are very dependent on lactase to break down that milk because the large intestine can't digest milk very well. So once the virus kind of invades, it makes them a lot shorter, as you can see on the picture in the right. And so there's less ability to absorb, there's less ability to break down milk, and large volumes of milk and other feed are getting into the large intestine that just can't handle it, and that's making our diarrhea worse. Not only that, but it also promotes increased secretions, so the intestine just starts churning out mucus and more fluid, which of course would contribute to your diarrhea as well. In foals, unfortunately, a lot of these pictures are probably too familiar to some people in the room, but clinical signs, severe watery diarrhea, not always hemorrhagic, but certainly in this year's populations of the ones that presented to us, we did have several that had quite hemorrhagic diarrhea, which is always disturbing. Colicky signs, a lot of them would get colicky, stop nursing before the diarrhea even hit, and so you got to notice this pattern in the foals of they'd be born, a day later they'd stop nursing, and you just know it was coming, and it was, I think, a very demoralizing event. Also affecting the small intestine, it can cause an ileus, so basically the small intestine isn't moving the way that it should. So in human infants and a lot of other species, you see vomiting and diarrhea, and this is the horse version of vomiting. It is refluxing and needing that nasogastric tube passed. So certainly this, unfortunately, picture on the left is something we saw quite a bit of this year. So what was different in this year? And I think my favorite part, I was going back to look at pictures to put in this presentation, and it started with really cute foals, and then somewhere around March it turned into just pictures of diarrhea, which was kind of horrific to go back through. And those are only the ones that I saw. So there was a marked increase in the incidence of watery and hemorrhagic diarrhea. And I think the biggest thing was the population that we saw this in. So these were very, very young foals. Again, really susceptible to severe disease secondary to diarrhea, susceptible to dehydration, malnutrition. All of those things are really big things to consider in an age group this young. And I think the most horrific thing is that some farms were experiencing up to 100% of the foals that were born after a certain period of time were having this diarrhea. And that is just, while the vast majority of them lived, it is just heartbreaking and soul-crushing to watch. Most of the mares that these foals were born to were vaccinated against the rotavirus A strain, and at the beginning, of course, we're running a lot of infectious disease panels, and everything is coming up negative. Rotavirus A was coming up negative. Some foals were positive for co-infection, so Clostridium was one we did see. And certainly Clostridium, mostly perfringens, can cause diarrhea in foals. It typically doesn't cause outbreaks like this, and a large number of healthy foals can also shed or harbor that bacteria. So it wasn't really making a lot of sense to us that we weren't getting a clear answer as to what was happening with these foals. And as you can imagine, this was rough. Much more rough for lots of people than it was for me. But this is just an example. If we're looking at our numbers presenting to isolation, just trying to compare from season to season, and one of the lovely medicine techs, Andrea Whittle, put this together for us. But as you can see, like 33 to 42 foals in this time period typically would present to our isolation unit. And we had 129 foals present this season. And that is just one referral center, only the ones that ended up going to isolation, not including the ones that maybe presented for other reasons sooner than 24 hours of age. And some of them even came with their poor mares who had, colic postpartum and ended up, with diarrhea at 48 hours of age. So that's a huge increase in this problem. So why is this happening? That was something that took us a little bit to figure out, and I really want it to be known that I did not figure it out at all. I just provided poop. So some of these foals were received perf positive, as we talked about. Is this a clostridial disease? Didn't really fit. We also had a lot of farms try and up their Clostridium plasma game, do oral clostridial plasmas, pre-treat or prophylactically give antimicrobials that should cover for Clostridium, and it really didn't make a big difference. And I think the most important thing about this whole outbreak is that people realized that these were not isolated events. It was once farms and veterinarians started talking to each other and saying, this is a huge problem among many farms, not just mine, that I think we really began to make strides in figuring out what was going on. So huge credit to the community here for working together to kind of start solving this. So we started the sampling. My favorite was when Dr. Adam from UK would kind of bring me chocolate bars and I would pass her off diarrhea samples, and that was great. So huge thanks goes out to all the researchers that have worked really hard on figuring out what exactly was happening this season, because again, it was pretty devastating, at least from a morale and probably financial standpoint in many ways. So we took lots of samples, collected lots of samples from healthy foals, once they were first born, when they got diarrhea at multiple time points, and then the mares as well, and they ran so many things on these samples. So the typical PCRs, culture, again, some of these, probably the most common sort of co-infection that was showing up was the Clostridium. And then a couple of these samples were actually looked at under electron microscopy, which is seen from the kind of paper that's come out recently on this disease. And they saw these rotaviral particles in the diarrhea samples, even though these foals were negative for equine rotavirus A. So that was kind of our hint that not only did this look like a rotavirus, but on electron microscopy we have some evidence as well. So fancy next generation sequencing that I don't understand, but again, huge thanks to the people that went through this, did identify a group B rotavirus in a lot of these samples. And I think one of the important things to note is that going back, so they have a lot of stored samples, but going back year to year, they did not identify this rotavirus in any of those samples whatsoever. So something that is certainly new this year. And I think another huge thing that came out of all of this is a pretty rapid development of a PCR test where we could actually test for this particular group of rotaviruses. So not only is that huge for the tail end of the diarrhea season this year, but for next year as well, for early detection, I think is going to be very, very helpful. So control, prevention, what worked, what didn't. Probably a lot of people in this room can speak to this better than I can. But prophylactic plasmas, again, a lot of these were clostridial based, didn't seem to sort of prevent it. Prophylactic antimicrobials, so some of these foals were coming out and we were pre-treating them or prophylactically treating them with metronidazole, other things to cover them, didn't really seem to make a huge difference. What really seemed to stop the cycle at certain farms, and I think every farm was a little bit different, was enhanced biosecurity. So all of the farms are already really, really good at biosecurity, especially in foaling season, but things had to change a little bit this year because of how quickly it was ripping through the barn. So personal protective equipment is huge, making sure everything's clean between foals. And a lot of farms had to either change foaling barns completely to a barn where nothing had ever been foaled before. Even that didn't stop it in some cases, and a lot of farms moved to trying to foal things outside, which is chilly and also a little bit different than how we typically do it, and that worked on some farms and it did not work on others. So I think the more we continue, again, having conversations kind of between us and between our the horsemen in the area, probably the better we're going to be able to help prevent at least the spread of this in the future. And then at some farms, really what stopped it was foals stopped being born, which is horrible. But I think everyone celebrated when the last foal on a farm was 72 hours of age, and we could just put it all behind us for at least a couple months. And that just really describes how draining this problem was. So impact, I only have a couple more slides, I promise. So impact, we need to think about not only direct but indirect costs as well. So cost of on-farm care was probably much higher this year than other years. Hospitalization of these sick cases, and I mean certainly bills could range from $4,000 to $8,000 depending on how these foals did in hospital. And just a personal observation is it seemed the longer this went on, the sicker the foals were that we were treating, and the harder it was to resolve the problem. So it took longer and longer and longer to get these foals to come around to a place where they could be discharged. Fortunately, we didn't have a lot of mortality with this problem, I think across the board, which is great, but certainly you have to worry about some of those secondary complications that we touched on at the beginning. Indirect costs, I think, are probably just being realized now. So are some of these foals a little bit smaller, slower to gain weight and condition than their age-matched controls, and that's not important at 3, 4, 5 years of age, but in a population that has to look great as yearlings, you don't have a lot of time to catch up in all these situations. And then there has been mention of, are some of these foals potentially increased susceptibility to other issues? Do we see them returning to the hospital? In some cases, yes, but I don't know that that's sort of clearly been defined. And then I think the most important one probably on this entire board is staff and veterinary morale. So not only at our hospital where our technical staff was working around the clock way more than they should from one ISO stall to the next, that's just our little island. Our ambulatory veterinarians, I'm sure a lot of them didn't go a single 24-hour period without being called about a foal with diarrhea. And when it's one to the next, that is horribly draining, especially before we had an answer as to what was going on. And certainly you have to translate that to the farm staff as well, who is caring for them. Everyone from the people cleaning to the account managers who are calling owners and telling them that your foal has the diarrhea. It's exhausting, and it certainly took its toll on, I think, a lot of us this year. Will it happen next year? This is a big question. I hate to say it, but probably. I hope it doesn't, and I hope we've learned some things from this year, and we can, again, testing more rapidly, figuring out that is what's going on more rapidly, and then prevention and management, some of these enhanced biosecurity things that we've developed may help us out. And then the big question is always, is there going to be a vaccine? I apologize to Zoetis. It's an old picture. Sorry about it. So there are about 3, in different areas of the world that are licensed or conditionally licensed against rotavirus A. Most of those, especially the one we use here, is against the G3 strain. It does cross-protect to the G14 a little bit as well. But what we do see with that is, again, this is a vaccine given to the mares. We see decreased incidence, decreased shedding, and decreased severity. And what we really saw with it is fewer young foals were getting sick. So it was the 3, 4, 5 months old foals that were coming down with rotavirus, and they're a little bit more able to fend off some of the severe complications. So funding is a big question. Our little bubble here always feels like there's a lot of money in the horse industry, but to a lot of our corporations, we're still maybe small potatoes in terms of how much money it does take to go from this idea of developing a vaccine to being licensed. That's a huge financial input for these companies, and would this be useful everywhere? That's a big question. But there certainly are ongoing studies, mostly out of the Gluck Center, to look at seroprevalence and then trying to purify these little horrible creatures so that we can start thinking about introducing it either into a new vaccine or into the current vaccine that we use and are fairly successful with in these mares. And that's it. I hope we have more of these clean foals this year.
Our next speaker tonight is Dr. Lutz Goehring. He's from UK, and we welcome Dr. Goehring. He's new at UK, so we're really glad to have him here. And he's going to be talking about herpes virus.
Thank you, Riddle. Dr. Riddle, thank you for the invitation. And yes, I'm the new guy, or the new addition to the Gluck Center. Started my job here at June 1st. Coming from Germany, that's not a fake accent I'm having. It's also why I'm wearing my Oktoberfest upper outfit. I spare you the leather parts down there. My topic will be on EHV1, equine herpes virus, number 1. And it's something that has stuck with me for all my academic career. I've been also to the Ogden outbreak in Utah in 2010, or dealt with horses from this outbreak when I was in Colorado at that time. I've also been to Valencia this year, which was the European eye-opener of equine herpes virus infection in this year, or for many actually in this year. And my focus here at UK will be to intensify my research, or intensify research on EHV1. I was provided with a question by Dr. Riddle, and the question is here, which probably comes from the audience. It's actually with a lot of ship-ins and a lot of horse traffic. How should I protect my farm, my training center, from the neurologic form of herpes? That was the question I got, and I thank you all for this question. It's an important question. It's a complex question, and when a speaker starts with "it's a complex question," it's a good question to answer, it always means he has to think a little bit about it. It's more complex to give you a straight answer. Otherwise, it wouldn't have come up either, anyway. So what I want to make sure is that we understand the pathogenesis, how this virus deals with the horse, how it tries to spread in a horse population, and where actually the dangerous areas are of virus spread into populations, or into a barn, or into a herd of horses, after introducing a horse that is new to the crowd. I put a little graph on here, and you can see there's a timeline at the bottom here, the x-axis. It's days after the infection. This is an experimental, an example of an experimental infection. We infect horses here at day 0 with a lot of virus initially, and then we follow them over several days, in this case here until day 14. What we usually see shortly after infection, when virus replicates in the respiratory tract of these horses, we see almost nothing. We see maybe a little bit of a fever, a little bit of a temperature increase, but it's not a fever, what we would call a fever. It's something that barely hits the 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 100.5 Fahrenheit, in that realm, roughly. So it does not jump into an area of a fever. This goes on for several days. Then all of a sudden there might be a fever. This is when virus goes into a systemic form of infection called viremia, when virus spreads through the bloodstream. This is a response of the body. We see, so there is a strong fever response in these horses. Fevers go up to 102, 103, 103.5 for several days, 3 to 5 days typically. Then fever breaks, and this is the critical part when we when the horse is at risk actually for the next 24, 48 hours to develop this neurologic disease, also called EHM. This is the red arrow in this graph here, and to the very right, I have a few spinal cord sections actually with this bleeding in the spinal cord section that causes these horses to go down. So immediately after this fever breaks, 24, 48 hours, that's the critical period when we see horses coming down with neurological disease. And if you look at the other graph here now, this is these two blue lines, or this curve, actually, not a real curve, but the blue lines, actually, they predict a little bit how much virus and when virus is shed through the respiratory tract into the environment. And we can see on this graph that during this very early inconspicuous time frame here, just shortly after the infection, this is where the bulk of virus is actually produced and is shed into the environment. Very inconspicuous area, so not even a fever, to name it, maybe a little bit of a trickle of nasal secretions, a horse that might not feel that great, but definitely nothing really to buy on. So with this in mind, certainly if you would transport a horse, you definitely want to make sure a horse is not bringing in virus that's spreading through airspace, that's shed with respiratory fluids into the environments. So on transportation, it would make a lot of sense to check these horses and make sure in their nasal secretions there are no pathogen viruses actually in there, or other pathogens, bacterial pathogens are listed, strangles here as well, that these pathogens are not introduced onto the farm, are not introduced into the herd. Definitely EHV1 is one of them you would like to check and make sure these pathogens are not on board entering your farm. However, with equine herpes virus, there is another specific situation with this virus, and this is this is depicted in this picture here. It's called latency and recrudescence. And what does this guy have to do with all this? This is Mr. Tsipras. He's the former Prime Minister of Greece. He was. This is a picture taken at the end of these endless negotiations about the euro in 2016, about the euro crisis, about refinancing Greece, about saving the euro. And this is a picture that was in the press after, I think, 5 or 6 days of negotiations. You can easily recognize that he has had several sleepless nights. He has puffy eyes. And if you look closely, you watch his lower lip, there is a little cold sore, which is a classic sign. I don't have proof if it is herpes simplex in his case, but it looks very much like herpes simplex in this guy. It's a situation, stressful situations, co-infection or disease can cause herpes simplex to wake up at its latent location. It comes back to the lower lip. It forms this blister. The blister secretions, they are infectious to others when in close contact. And this is the situation I would like to describe, which needs further attention if you consider to bring in horses onto your premises. What happens is latency is a silent virus presence hidden deep somewhere in the body of the horse. It's something typical for all alpha herpes viruses. EHV1 is one of them. Herpes simplex is another one. You may have heard of varicella zoster, the cause of shingles in adults. It's all herpes viruses out of a specific group that go into latency. It's after the acute infection. So they hide out there, and there's periodic reawakening, which means virus can wake up under certain circumstances. It leaves that location. It turns back. In case of the horse, it turns back to the respiratory tract. It replicates there in the respiratory epithelium, and it's spread into your horse population. Immunity buildup, even if you vaccinate, is not that great with equine herpes virus. So the rest of your group is at risk to become infected through this one horse that has woken up virus and send it back to the respiratory tract to be shed in the environment. Many horses carry virus because we know it's a children's disease. Many horses get it as a yearling, as a foal, as a yearling at young age. And in most of the horses, once infected, they remain infected in this at this latent stage. It's probably a lifelong infection. There are regional differences. I think East Coast United States, West Coast United States, Europe. We have a very high percentage of latent infected horses there. There are thinner areas around the globe, or when we go further to the west. But we can account for a large proportion of horses that are infected, latent infected with EHV1. So what's the frequency of recrudescence then? So waking up, what's the frequency of that? Nobody knows exactly. It's probably a very rare event. That's our lucky phase. So it's not as common as recrudescence of herpes simplex and causing a cold sore. It is considered a rare event. We have looked in all directions. We have looked at horse populations transported east to west, flown from Europe to the United States and back. We checked these horses if under these circumstances, if they upregulate, if they have recrudescence of EHV1. However, it's a tiny number where we find these events. However, still, there are these outbreaks, Valencia in Spain or Wellington here in Florida, where exactly this happened and spread into the remainder of the population, happened with subsequent disease in these cases. I can't stress it enough. In my experience and from the data so far published, this is a very rare event. However, we need to consider this if we look at horses that are coming new into our population, into a herd at a farm at a new spot. So my recommendations would be there, and I forgot to mention, because this reawakening and the phase of transportation back into the respiratory tract before this virus becomes infectious. There's a little bit of time necessary for that, and I would say it's 5 to 7 days, which takes this virus up in the respiratory tract to be productively spread into the environment. So the gold plan really, to not make absolutely sure, because you never can be absolutely sure in biology, but to make as much as possible sure that you don't bring in something, that something is upregulating there and is spreading into your population. There would be, in addition to the test upon arrival, there would also be a test after 7 to 10 days in a certain area of quarantine. So this would mean in this case, you would bring the horses in, you keep them in a separate area, and you keep them apart from the remainder of the group. These horses still can be productive. They still can be ridden normally. They should just not have crossings with other horses. They should not have nose-to-nose contacts with other horses. They should be ridden after the resident population, or should be trained and exercised after the resident population has been done their thing. And then I would recommend a second swab by testing between days 7 and 10. So that would be the gold plan for this disease. The second best option is, because it is a very rare occasion that recrudescence happens, and you consider transportation to be uneventful, nothing suspicious during those days of quarantine in this horse, you can also wait 14 days after the initial testing at day 1 upon arrival, wait 14 days of quarantine, and then skip the additional testing. I think this is safe enough to consider this. because of, again, that risk of recrudescence is very, very low. I think I stay right on time. Horses are returning. There are special situations maybe you want to consider returning from an event or a location where EHV1 was recently detected. There should be stricter isolation of these horses. You take temperatures and watch out for additional signs. You take nasal swab upon arrival, and if no if no signs are visible during this observational time, take a second swab by day 10. If you have that result back as a negative one, then take a third sample to make absolutely sure these horses did not bring anything onto your farm. These horses did not upregulate anything because of stress of transportation and stress of disease in the other farm, to make sure you don't transfer disease here in your healthy population. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Goehring. Our next speaker tonight is going to be Dr. Katy Dern. Many of you have already met her. She's going to be addressing the latest information on laparoscopic surgery. Thank you, Dr. Dern.
All right, thanks everybody for sticking around. I'm kind of today just going to give a little bit of a broad view of some of the basic equine laparoscopic surgeries that we do in our hospital, and then if I have time at the end, if Linda doesn't kick me off, then I'll hit along a little more specialized one. I'll start off at Dr. Riddle's request with a definition of laparoscopy. It's actually a German word in origin, and I'd venture a pronunciation if Dr. Goehring weren't here. But importantly, it was first done in domestic dogs, and then humans took it over, and it became very prevalent in use. We all know, someone that's had a laparoscopic surgery, often gallbladder surgery or ovarian surgery in women. But in horses, we have the same benefits of it in that it's minimally invasive, so we have smaller incisions, which is important due to their exposure to their environment. So we do the same types of surgery, so multiple small incisions, one for a scope, and then other small incisions for the instrumentation. And then for us, it provides both a diagnostic and a therapeutic purpose. So we can see problems, and then many times in the case of some of the surgeries I'm going to talk about today, we can solve the problem. So we can take out the pathologic ovary, we can take out the abdominal testicle, or break down adhesions in the abdomen. We're all really comfortable with the idea of minimally invasive surgery with joints already, and just to kind of illustrate that, the other night in the hospital, I took a picture of, on the top there in that image, that's an arthroscope. So that's a 4mm arthroscope that we use for arthroscopy every day, and below that is our 10mm laparoscope. So it's large. So it's minimally invasive, but it's still pretty big. So just something to think about there. I thought it was a pretty interesting image. Indications for laparoscopy, and again, this is just a very broad view. I just wanted to provide some basic information. Today I'm going to go over cryptorchidism, so horses that have a retained abdominal testicle. Obviously, if it's a high flanker and an inguinal testicle, then we don't need to use laparoscopy to get those. The other would be an ovariectomy. So we have two main types of ovariectomies that we do, and that's to remove a pathologic ovary or behavioral, bilateral ovariectomies for behavioral reasons. And then again, if we have time, I'll go over just a quick kind of colic laparoscopic procedure, which would be a nephrosplenic space ablation. And I included that image. So this is a horse, actually, this is up at our Saratoga Hospital in dorsal recumbency, because one of the main advantages that laparoscopy provides us that comes to light when you talk to surgeons like Dr. Embertson, who used to have to do ovariectomies on horses in dorsal. In horses, the ovaries, kind of like us, they're right there at the base of their back. So you can appreciate if your only approach was with a horse lying on its back, it would be very difficult to visualize the vasculature and to feel like you had gotten hemostasis and were happy with your approach. And you would obviously have a lot of the horse's gastrointestinal tract in the way. So now we can do these surgeries standing, and you'll see some images as we go through. We can see the ovarian pedicle really well, and we're able to stay away from gastrointestinal structures. I'll start with a cryptorchidectomy. So the image on the left, you can see at the top would be the abdomen, and then at the bottom is a testicle descended into the scrotum. And you can kind of see the incredible journey that it has to go through to descend into the scrotum. So it has multiple small rings of tissues that it has to pass through as the foal, or as the fetus is developing, and then as the foal is developing. And if anything in the hormonal cascade of events causes aberrant descent, that's how we end up with a cryptorchid. So in some horses, it stops it from even coming out of the abdomen. That's usually the left one. And then in some horses, it makes it down just kind of into the inguinal canal, which is that little narrow spot, and it stays there. Abdominal versus inguinal, we have a pretty good idea of the percentage. Interestingly, this problem has a 17% prevalence, up to 17% in some studies, and a lot of that is dependent on the breed, so that's kind of across all breeds. We definitely don't see that high of a prevalence in our thoroughbred racehorses. It's higher in saddlebreds, quarter horses, those types of horses. And then 75% of the left testicles, left cryptorchids are retained abdominally, and right are usually inguinal, and that's related to the size they are when they pass through. So I'll take you kind of through, if your horse comes in for a cryptorchidectomy, what kind of patient preparation we go through. One of the most important things that you'll hear me repeat multiple times about laparoscopy is that we fast them. And that's because for us to have appropriate visualization, we need to insufflate the abdomen with CO2. And for us to be able to manipulate the structures, whether the ovary, testicle, intestine, whatever, we need to be able to have room free from the gastrointestinal tract. And so for that to happen, we need to have all the high ball K and everything that takes up a lot of room out of there. So it's something we're pretty fastidious with. A lot of us will have the horse come in the hospital the night before so that we can kind of be the bad guy and muzzle it, or we'll ask you to muzzle them and just make sure that they don't eat anything, because it can definitely affect our surgical speed and our outcome. Medications, pretty basic for elective surgery. We use broad spectrum antimicrobials, so that would be potassium penicillin and gentamicin for us. NSAIDs, either phenylbutazone or flunixin meglumine is appropriate, and tetanus toxide. And then if the horse is going to be going under general anesthesia, so in the case of a cryptorchidectomy, we do preoperative blood work just to make sure they're a good anesthetic candidate. I included this image because if you look, so this horse's head is on the left, he's in dorsal recumbency, tail is on the right. A big part of our kind of workup in these horses is after we drop them under general anesthesia, a lot of them, they come in as cryptorchids, but when we drop them under general anesthesia, we can palpate the other testicle either in the inguinal canal or descended through the ring. And this horse is pretty typical of our patients. There's one testicle in the scrotum. So what we would then do is palpate his inguinal rings and see if we can feel a testicle even in the inguinal canal, then we'll attempt to remove it via traditional methods. Obviously, laparoscopy wouldn't be indicated in that case. But if we palpate his inguinal canal, and we can't feel a testicle there, then we'll proceed with our laparoscopic surgery. So this is an image of, the image on the left is the horse laying on its back, so that's his abdomen, and then his head would be at the top and his tail would be at the bottom. And this just shows where you could expect incisions, like healing incisions if your horse came home after a laparoscopic cryptorchidectomy. So the middle portal, so that red circle is where we gain entry into the abdomen. And picking that spot is really important to us because we want an area that doesn't have a lot of musculature and doesn't have a lot of vascular supply. We want like a really nice, clean entry. We want to be certain that we're in the abdomen. We want really good visualization of the abdominal structures. Those little dash lines on the other side are like variable places that we could put instrument portals. So once we can see inside the abdomen, then we're going to take instruments, we're going to manipulate GI structures, the testicle, ductus deferens, different structures so that we can get to the point where we can safely get the testicle out of the abdomen, or obviously in the case of the mare, get the ovary out. The image on the right shows us, not me personally, but someone making that initial entry into the abdomen. So we have a trocar obturator cannula unit, and then we enter into the abdomen through the perineum and then insert the camera through that first portal. And this is what we see. So I kind of put these two images up to compare two things. We use patient positioning to our advantage, and the other thing is the difference between a fasted and non-fasted patient. So again, we're a little neurotic about fasting them, but if you look at the image on the left, you can see on the right side of that image, there's that thing with that pink mark on the top, that's the small colon. So that's full of feed material that's right before the rectum. If we puncture that or hit that, things don't go well. So we like it to be very empty. So that's why we hold them off of feed, make sure some people will give them even like 3 days low bulk feed. On the left of the image on the left, kind of the top, that large fluid-filled structure, bladder. Sometimes we'll also catheterize these guys so that that's not in our way. And that little piece of white tissue, kind of just peeking in between, is an abdominal testicle hiding in there. So to help us visualize this, so even, if we got in there and we're like, oh shoot, this horse didn't fast down well, what we'll do is we'll tilt them into what we call Trendelenburg position, which is basically taking their body, instead of laying straight on their back, we lift their hind legs up into the air, and that gives us the image on the right. So that basically pulls the GI tract towards the front of their abdomen and gives us a lot better visualization. In the image on the right, that's the bladder kind of in the center, and then those laparoscopic forceps are holding an intra-abdominal testicle. So you can see we use positioning, fasting, just kind of our patient prep on these laparoscopic patients is pretty critical for us. Post-operative plan on these guys, I like to get 1 week stall rest with hand walking. To our advantage is the fact that the cryptorchid testicle is usually really small, so these incisions are really small. And you'll see in the next slides on the ovariectomy, sometimes our incisions aren't quite as tiny. So I put a standard bred racehorse in there because generally they don't adhere to the longest times that I give them for their recovery. But I like to get 1 week stall rest with hand walking, and then NSAIDs post-operative. We don't do prolonged antimicrobial therapy on these horses. Next kind of subset of cases I'm going to cover are mares in need of ovariectomy. And again, these are just like 2 very specific ones that we do, but obviously there's a wide array of reasons to take ovaries out of these mares. The first one would be a mare with an ovarian abnormality. Main one that we see is a granulosa cell tumor, and I put that image in there of a stallion with a mare because these tumors are often testosterone producing, and so these mares come into us exhibiting stallion-like behavior. Mounting other mares on the trail, just all sort of range of behavior. They'll tease, and then flame in response, which is what that stallion is exhibiting, is one of those. The other kind of basic type of ovariectomy we do would be a bilateral ovariectomy for behavioral reasons. And so there's your pretty classic mare mean mug there. Our patient preparation for bilateral ovariectomies, this is a standing surgery, and that's kind of for that reason that I spoke about initially, where those ovaries, they're hanging down from her back essentially, and so we can see them really well if we keep her standing. That comes with its own set of complications, and luckily the image I have there is actually just from the other day. We have a really good anesthesia team, and so they're really good at titrating the balance between making it so that these mares are calm and they can't feel what's going on, but so that they're still standing, because they have to stand, and they have to stand evenly for us to be able to complete this surgery effectively. We also have a set of stocks, fairly new, that we can manipulate up and down, so we can sink it into the floor if we need to, if that allows us better instrument manipulation or visualization, or we can raise it up for your shorter mares. Again, I'll say it again, fasting, at least 12 hours. Some mares I'll do even more. Sometimes we have them in hospital and they figure out a way to get through their muzzle, so their surgery gets delayed, because it is very important to us that they're fasted. Medications, again, are standard, elective surgery, intravenous antimicrobials, NSAIDs, phenylbutazone, or flunixin, and then a tetanus toxoid. And another thing that often shocks owners is, they know that their horse is coming in for a laparoscopic surgery. It's a big clip job. So you can see that this mare is shaved for a large portion of her, over her back there. So I think that surprises people, because we still have to get the ovary out of an incision, and oftentimes it's an enlarged ovary. So I always try to warn owners, especially when I was up north in the winter, they have to blanket afterwards. Once we get, do our approach in the abdomen for the granulosa cell mares, this is what we're looking as far as an intraoperative view. So just to orient you, the mare's back obviously is on top, and then The images that you're seeing are the ovary hanging down and then the uterine horn. So in the images on the left, you can see the wide degree of variability that we see in just mares. So we had 2 mares that were almost like this just the other day. One really skinny, nice, lean ovarian pedicle. You could just see all the vasculature perfectly. And then the other one, the mare had quite a lot of intra-abdominal fat, which made the surgery slightly more complicated. Of no consequence to her, but it just makes it take longer to manipulate. And again, you can see with the small colon, down in the bottom left image, you can see the GI tract. That's why it's really important for us to fast them, because even if they're fasted, we still see quite a lot of bulk. So the left images are just looking, you can see the ovarian, the ovary, the ovarian blood supply. Those are both normal ovaries. And then you can see the uterine horn and then the oviduct where it connects between the ovary and the uterine horn. The middle images are further along in the surgery. So the top image in the middle is us blocking, so instilling lidocaine just like we would for a lameness exam, but this time it's just so that we can do surgery on her pedicle, ovarian pedicle, without her feeling it. And once we have her blocked, then we can take those instruments and we can manipulate the ovary more freely. And then the image on the bottom middle is us using an electrothermal sealing device, a ligature, that both coagulates the vascular supply and then cuts for us. And one of the parts of this surgery that's always a little more dicey is when you have your last, you have your hold of the ovary and you go to make your last cut, and then you have to get the ovary out before the mare decides she's done with the surgery. The image all the way on the right is just the ovarian pedicle with just a nice sealed off blood supply. You can see there's no blood dripping, and I included that one because that's really important to us, is to be able to visualize that area in these mares. There's a wide degree of variability in the size of these ovaries. So the top left image is 2 normal ovaries taken out of a mare the other day. Bottom left image is a granulosa cell tumor with that pretty typical honeycomb appearance. And then the image on the right is the largest granulosa cell tumor I have ever taken out. That mare, we couldn't get it out standing. I basically detached it from her abdomen standing, but then we had to get it out through a colic approach on ventral midline. She was very happy. The post-operative plan for these mares is 30 days stall rest with hand walking, and that's basically to allow that body wall to heal. And in this image, she has a spray adhesive bandage over her incisions, but you can see even though the surgery was laparoscopic, the instruments were through small holes, to get the ovary out of her, we still had to make a fairly large incision. So I always want to make sure that owners, expect that. These mares are super tough. They do really well with these incisions, so we don't have a lot of complications with them. And I make sure that they stay on Banamine for a time period after. Linda gave me the red X, so I better skip through those guys. But our conclusions, for laparoscopy are that it is minimally invasive. It gives us increased visualization, which for us means safer surgeries often, and it can be a quicker return to work depending on how you manage your cases.
Thank you, Dr. Dern. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Heath Soignier. He's going to talk about chiropractic, and I think it's a very good subject and something that we all need to learn more about.
For sure.
Thank you.
All right. So thank y'all for coming. We appreciate you, everybody being here and everybody that's watching online. So it's pretty cool. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about the benefits of veterinary spinal manipulative therapy, which is chiropractic. Anybody here been to a chiropractor? Yeah, everybody's awesome, isn't it? So your horses think it's awesome too. And acupuncture as well. Just learn how to do that, so we're good there. So what is it? What is veterinary spinal manipulative therapy? So it's a safe and effective treatment modality. Pretty much everybody here raised their hand, so they're still here with us, so you know it's safe. It does, affect the nervous system. That's the main thing that people want to understand from this talk. It's not about moving bones or joints. It's actually manipulating the nervous system to allow neuromodulation so that we are pain-free. That's the main thing we're working on here. So just a little bit of terminology. The last time I gave this talk, it took about an hour, so I'm going to break this down in about 15 minutes. So I'm going to throw a whole lot at you real fast. So mobilization, so that's the act of a joint that's going from normal range of motion to passive range of motion. So that's just normally how you walk, how your joints move. That's the way it's That's just mobilization of joint. So when we manipulate a joint, we're taking it from that passive range of motion, so where the most extent you can raise your arm, and we're going to push it over into a paraphysiological space without tearing ligaments and things of that nature, okay? So that's whenever you have an adjustment made, that's what you're feeling. We're pushing it into that space without going too far. Wait, there's a whole lot more. So when we talk about biomechanics, you know, you hear podiatrists love to talk about biomechanics of the feet and how they shape shoes and things of that nature to help the horse travel. Every motion you have in your body goes through a biomechanic. So either if you have too much weight, too less weight, how your body moves, those things are affected throughout everything. So when we talk about motion units, it's each of those units within a joint, so in between each space. So not just in your distal limbs. This is from your entire intervertebral spine, which I have a picture. It's pretty cool. Okay. Oh, yeah, I've got a couple more definitions here. This horse is really tall. Not that I'm really short, okay? And thanks to my tech for helping me put this together today. We took these pictures today. Typical Heath fashion. So acupuncture. I just learned how to do this therapy here recently. I've treated myself, so it's kind of cool too. But it can be used, you know, everybody wants to think, when you think acupuncture, think Chinese medicine. The one I learned is more of a functional neurology, I guess is the best way to describe it. So we're affecting nerves and muscle fibers and myofascia throughout the body. So you can really attack the peripheral nervous system, the central nervous system, autonomic nervous system. So like chiropractics is the same thing. Each adjustment you make, each needle that we put in is affecting the nervous system. And that's what we're trying to do to neuromodulate pain throughout the body. You know, when we do the acupuncture, even the chiropractic, it's more the exam that's telling us the needles is about 10% of the entire, or the adjustment is about 10% of the entire appointment. It's more of figuring out why we're sore, where we're sore at, and why things aren't moving like they're supposed to. So just a few things that this can help with is increased blood flow, perfusion of tissues, relaxing muscles, you know, stimulating individual nerve bundles and nerves. So if you have like facial nerve paralysis and things of that nature, this can really help. So I thought this is pretty cool because, you know, the question that was proposed is like, how can it help my yearling walk better at the sale or weanling walk better at the sale? You know, these guys, when we're looking at them, you know, they're just sitting there all pretty and whatnot, what have you. But what we know when we're not looking, that's kind of more or less is what it's like, right? So they're fighting and everything else. And if they're anything like my kids are, they're 3 and 5, you know, they can body slam each other and they're fine. But sometimes they, you know, they actually hurt themselves. And a lot of times they don't tell you other than they just don't walk right, or they just kind of look off. They're not eating their feed like they're supposed to, or not growing like they're supposed to. And we can find some things that are wrong with them. So, you know, I talked about the joints a minute ago. It's like, so you have all of these different joint spaces here, right? And on each of these intervertebral segments, there's a whole lot of them. There's actually multiple joints on each of those. So, you know, a lot of times when we talk about joints in horses, we're talking about distal limb joints, right? 1, 2. These guys have about 4 to 8 per intervertebral segment, so it's a lot. So just for the intervertebral spine in a horse, this is kind of our little formula, so just kind of give you an idea. Some breeds have less. Arabians, they're weird. So, you know, a lot of times, hey, how can this help my horse, right? So most commonly I usually see horses for, you know, we've had it on butane stall rest and it's not seemed to helping. Or just, hey, I need to figure out something else different. And I use this a lot with other complementary therapies, you know, your PT and rehab. So just some conditions that may help, you know, pain, behavioral changes. You got some horses, hey, he's been fine, and all of a sudden now he's trying to bite my face. Like our beautiful little gray horse that's been on some of these pictures, she's kind of that way. But once you start working on her, she's kind of turns into an angel. You know, unexplained lamenesses, a lot of TMJ issues. You see quite a bit of that. And then the other sports injuries, you know, just from horses, they hurt a front leg and now their back leg hurts because they shift that weight over to, you know, compensate for that. So they can get some pain and aches, and when those muscles aren't moving like they're supposed to, you know, the idea is to open up those guys and let them move like they're want to. So just a few contraindications. Horses with severe arthritis, this doesn't seem to, you know, when you go to the chiropractor, if you got tons of arthritis with enthesiophytes within those joints, he's not going to adjust you because he will make you worse. So if you got horses that, motioning joints and it doesn't feel quite right, we're going to take x-rays. And if x-rays don't look good, then we're not going to adjust that horse. We're going to do some other things that can help. Fracture for sure, so that's not good. And then you get some horses you just can't put needles in or get your hands on to look at. So you just do the best you can. I get that question a lot about yearlings. Will they let you stand on the bell next to them, or will they let you put needles in? I'd say about 98% of the horses I work on, usually if I can get eye adjustment in or eye needle in, they usually settle in and really like the therapy. But there's a couple that not going to happen. Okay, these were on an old slide, okay, so just bear with me. So before I'll do any adjustments or even put any needles in, the most important thing is to do your physical exam. And that's everything. So it's break down to the muscles, the myofascia, even a neurological exam. You can have something going on in the brain. So again, going back to that CNS, right, we're really attacking that. So that's what we want to make sure we examine and make sure there's not something else going on, like a brain tumor or something crazy like that. So, gathering good history. Is this something new? Has this been happening for a long time? That kind of stuff. And then, of course, what's your intended use? Do you need this horse to go jump a meter 30 next week, or are you just going to watch it when I walk around the pasture tomorrow? So these are fun. All right, so some things that we look for when doing these exams. So I like the little triad of symptoms. So heat, tenderness, and lack of motion. You'll talk a lot of people talk about when they see a chiropractor, it's stuck. I prefer to use restricted because it's not moving in the motion plane or how it's supposed to be doing. So it's very important to look at those things. And then any neurological deficits is very important. And as well as why isn't my patient being able to do the job that it's supposed to do comfortably. Ooh, another one. That was fun. All right, so is chiropractic neurology?
So yes, I'm talking about something relatively different tonight. And, usually I'm talking about radiographs or yearlings, but tonight I'm going to talk about what can we do to attract and retain future equine veterinarians. I know all of you on farms are having very difficult time finding help. Well, we're seeing it in the veterinary world as well, and just want to address some few things and maybe figure out some things that we can do. So first we need to go through really what's happening. We look at every year the AVMA, which is the American Veterinary Medical Association, looks at the number of students that are going into veterinary medicine and what fields. Equine veterinary medicine has always been right around 4% since I've been looking at it since the early 90s when I graduated. And it has gone down significantly. This started in 2008, and right now we're currently at about 1% of students going into equine veterinary medicine, which is scary when you think of the population in general of veterinarians. 5.6% of us are equine veterinarians. So we're not going to be able to keep up, and we need to look at this a little bit further. But probably a more disturbing statistic is basically, this is from the American Association of Equine Practitioners, but within 5 years post-graduation, 50% of our equine veterinarians leave equine practice. So this is just some pictures of myself and my interns, our Christmas cookies every year. In these pictures, at least 2 of these veterinarians are no longer in equine practice. Most of them actually they're in small animal practices now. So we need to kind of look at that and figure out why and what can we do. So being a veterinarian is proving to be hard on your mental health. If you look at all U.S. adults, about 1 in 25 have experienced some form of serious mental illness. In a 2015 study by the American Veterinary Medical Association, 1 in 11 veterinarians experienced this serious psychological distress. And 1 in 6 veterinarians experienced suicidal thoughts. And the picture on the right is Not One More Vet. I don't know if any of you have heard of this on Facebook, but it's an organization that started when, in 2014, a world-renowned veterinarian took her own life. And it really started this movement because we do have a high suicide rate in veterinary medicine. So there's another study that came out this year in JAVMA, which is the American Veterinary Medical Association journal, and they looked at compassion satisfaction. So that's basically the pleasure that you derive from your work. They looked at burnout, which I'm sure all of us know what burnout is, exhaustion, frustration, anger, depression. And then also secondary traumatic stress, which is something I wasn't really familiar with, but it's work-related mental trauma. So say you have a patient that dies, you're dealing with a grieving owner, you take that home. And that's part of the, the issues I think that some veterinarians are dealing with. And when you look at these numbers, this is all veterinarians. This is not just equine. This is all full-time veterinarians in the United States. 35% have this low compassion satisfaction. So they really are not getting pleasure from their work, which is, we all want to be happy in what we're doing and thrilled. They also, about 50% of the veterinarians have high burnout scores. So again, something, what can we do here? And almost 60% have high secondary traumatic stress scores, meaning they're taking these work-related incidences home and taking them personal to themselves. So the AEP, which is American Association of Equine Practitioners, so that's our equine veterinarians, and the American Veterinary Medical Association got together and they wanted to look at, is equine practice different? Are we seeing anything different? And what we found out was, really our equine veterinarians are in pretty good physical health, which makes sense. I mean, this is a very physical job, and they do pretty well there. But then when we get to mental health, and they split this up between men and women, and men had 18% fair to poor mental condition, and then the women had 25% poor mental, fair, poor, or very poor mental condition. So one in four, which that's a pretty big number. So really we are seeing these same issues in equine practice as we are in general veterinary practice, but we're also seeing people leave equine practice and going to small animal practices. So let's look at it a little bit deeper. So Dr. Grice, this is a survey she did in 2019. She's an equine practitioner who basically coaches and consults now. And she has these decade one groups, so it's veterinarians that are, it's all equine, and they're veterinarians that have been out of school for less than 10 years. And she has come up with basically these 4 things that are affecting us and why people are leaving equine practice. And number 1 is long hours and lifestyle. And you can imagine, equine practitioners do have longer hours than most small animal practitioners. Lifestyle, it is a lifestyle. Actually, it's one that I pretty much enjoyed. This is a very old picture, but some of you who know my kids will laugh, but that's Vivian in the middle, Audra on the right, and Dr. Embley's daughter, Savannah, on the left. But what I like and loved about equine practice is feeling that, hey, I can take my kids with me. I went on calls with my dad growing up, and the equine industry as a whole is very open to having kids be there, because I think so many of us, the reason why we are with horses oftentimes is our parents were. So emergency duty, that's another issue that we're seeing, and a reason people are leaving equine practice. Small animal, they have emergency clinics. So they are pretty much working, their normal day hours with non-emergency cases. One thing these studies did show was that the higher number of people you have in a practice, which would be some of the bigger practices around here, the less emergency you have. But maybe that's not really the case, because in this area, pretty much everybody has their veterinarian's cell phone number, I bet. And when you have a problem, you call your veterinarian, correct? So, and this is partly our fault. You don't know if they're on call or not, because we don't tell you if they're on call or not. So you're gonna call them, but maybe there's some things that we can do in that aspect so that we're not taking their time when they're not on call. Culture of the industry. This is a common complaint as well, just that, maybe you have some of us older practitioners that work 7 days a week, and, we think you should too. But that's not always right? And same with farm managers. I'm sure that you're dealing with that, where you're there 7 days a week because you feel that you need to be, or maybe you don't have somebody that can follow you up. So that is a culture in the equine industry, because horses need 24/7 care. And then low compensation, which is something that Equine practitioners do start out with a lower salary than what small animal, than what you can enter small animal for, but that's something that we need to work on as practice managers. So those 3 girls are now these 3 girls. So that's Savannah on the left, Vivian in the middle, and Audra on the right. So how can we make it a better lifestyle? You know, my kids are in Pony Club, and they really, well, Vivian especially wants to be a veterinarian, but she gets told time and time again, don't do it. You won't be able to ride your horse. It's just not, that's not true. You can ride your horse, but maybe we need to set some more boundaries where we do have that time, where we don't feel like we can't ride because we may get a call. So we have to work through that. What's possible for this better lifestyle? You know, maybe a flexible work schedule. We do have a few veterinarians that only work in the spring, and they're off in the fall. And some of them that are off in the fall, maybe they only work a couple weeks a month. You know, they're not off the entire time, but they're not 24/7, 7 days a week. The other issue, and this is our fault, is maybe you don't have known backup for that veterinarian. So whoever your primary veterinarian is, we need to make sure that you know other veterinarians in our practice and are comfortable with them, because we are comfortable with them being on an emergency schedule and seeing any of your horses on an emergency basis. So we want to make sure that you are as well. We need to work on that. 4 days a week. So this is interesting. You know, a lot of small animal veterinarians, that is their work week, 4 days. Now they may have longer hours on those 4 days, but there's 3 days that they're off. We are seeing this in equine as well. We are seeing it in small group practices, maybe 3 to 5 veterinarians, and I'm seeing it in New York, in Virginia, where they're able to make this work. And the reason they are able to make it work is because they have that support of the other veterinarian, the client knows the other veterinarian, and there's that level of comfort and also expertise. You have to make sure that, you know, everybody can practice at that same level. But it does work. We're seeing it. So, you know, maybe that's a possibility in the future. So what are they asking for? They are asking for time, our younger, newer veterinarians. They value their time, as Audra's looking at her watch here on her cross country, but they really want time away from work, but they're able and willing to work extremely hard when they are working, but then they want that separation. So decrease emergency schedule. And you know what we ask of clients is maybe to try to schedule your routine work during the week. You know, it's not always possible, you know that, but for the most part, let's try to do that. One thing they want is when they're not on call, maybe they don't want to be called, but we are all tied to our phones. You all have our numbers, and we're not telling you we're not on call. So we're going to get called. So we need to work on that. You know, we have had discussions about call forwarding. You know, if you're not on call, do you forward your phone to the person that's on call? Please don't go back to your farms and tell them that Dr. Spike said we're going to have call forwarding. But I want you to think that that's a possibility, you know, but it wouldn't be without your consent and a discussion in making sure you have that known entity backup so that you're not meeting someone the first time on an emergency where you have this valuable animal, valuable maybe monetarily, but also personally, and it's with someone you don't know. So those are things that we need to work on, but that's a possibility. And other thing that we started this year is zones when you're on call. So maybe you've called into the hospital with an emergency and we have somebody working the north side and somebody working the south side. And it's just more efficient for the veterinarian, which if you have an emergency in North Bourbon County and then your next emergency is South Jessamine County, you can imagine the stress that puts on the veterinarian as well. So these are just things that we're trying to do. We ask for your help. If you have ideas, we're all open, because this is something that we're going to need to address in the future, or quite frankly, we're going to have a hard time being able to service our animals. So for me, being an equine veterinarian has been extremely rewarding, and we need to be role models for these kids that want to be veterinarians. But if we have students coming in and we are stressed and burned out and just need to get away from it, we're not encouraging our next generation to be veterinarians. So we need to encourage equine practice. We need to let them have time to ride their horse, take their dog to the dog park, go to a Cardinals game. You know, we need to give them the time to do the things that make their life fulfilling, and then practice is going to be more fulfilling as well. One issue we have is veterinary schools are not encouraging of equine practice, and you know, many of the professors who the students look up to will say, you're going to have to work really hard, you're not going to get paid anything, which is not true. We are going to work very hard, but we are also, it's a very rewarding profession. When you look at those compassion fatigue and whatnot, actually equine rates better than small animal. That's what tells us that we have to improve our game on where we are and how veterinarians are working. We need to compensate them appropriately, and we really need to be cheerleaders for this next generation, because if you look at the numbers, it just doesn't work if it continues at the same trend. So please thank your veterinarians and try to work with them and figure out ways where we can give them the time that they need and value. And that's all I have. So again, want to thank all of our sponsors, and thank you guys for being here. Thanks for the people online. And Dr. Riddle?
No, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here, and I was going to announce the winner of our contest. If anybody is here who can tell me who that winner is, that'd be great. Okay, and is she still coming, do you know? Dr. Katy Dern is the winner. Okay, thank you all for coming, and drive carefully, and if I don't see you soon, I'll see you at the same meeting next year. Thank you.